Here we are now in chapter 5, and now we're moving into macroeconomics. And so now, if you are taking microeconomics, Econ 4, or you have taken it before, now we're going to diverge away, and we're going to cover much different material now from now on. Now, chapter 5 looks at overall what we're going to cover throughout the rest of the semester. It gives you a summary, and it gives you a little background on economic theory. And we start out by talking about the main focus of macroeconomics is the business cycle. Business cycle is a term used to describe the ups and downs of real GDP as well as other economic variables. Gross domestic product is GDP, and this is the nation's total production. And the real means is that it's adjusted for inflation. And in chapter 6, we'll see how that's done. Any business cycle has 4 parts. There's the good part. The economy is doing well. We call that an expansion. Production is increasing. And when production is increasing, usually unemployment is falling. And you might get more inflation, higher prices. As resources are bidded up, we have higher demand for cement, for computer circuits, things like that, and for labor. And then all things tend to end. We reach a peak. And then the economy goes into a downturn, a recession. And that's when unemployment starts to rise, like it did when the economy tanked in late February, March of 2020. And then there is a little good news, and that is the inflationary problems tend to go away, tend to decrease as we have less inflationary pressures. And then, so far, every recession has ended. Well, I shouldn't say that. We're in a new recession right now. This is the fall of 2020. Down here, we tend to look at our GDP graphical, and this would be real GDP over here. That's the nation's total production. Down here is time. And so it tends to look something like this. I'll just kind of draw it in freehand. Something like that. And so this would be our peak of a cycle. This downturn, that would be a recession. This would be the trough down here at the bottom, and that would be an expansion. Hits another peak, goes into a recession, hits a trough, goes expansion. So it repeats itself. That's why it's called a cycle. It ups. And in macroeconomics, what we want to do is try to avoid these ups and downs. We like to squish this thing together as much as possible. In a perfect world, we like to have just a straight line. Not going to happen, but we want to get as close to that line as possible to avoid the damages of, say, too high a spike, which can be inflationary, as well as the negative aspects of recessions. And you can see the way I've drawn it, when I drew this line through it, it is going upward. And so you could say that the long-term trend is upward. That is being affected adversely in the last 10 years or so. The Great Recession of 2008 to about 2009, 2010 was a very severe recession, the worst one since the Great Depression. And the one we're in right now, we don't know yet how bad it's going to be. Prior to these two recessions, since the Second World War, the recessions were getting less severe and the expansions were getting longer. Not quite sure what's happening right now. And that's part of the kind of interesting aspect of macroeconomics, is that no time period is the same. Things are always different. We have some basic understanding of how things operate, but again, each expansion, each recession, we have so many different variables going on, especially right now with the virus, that has an impact on the economy, and they are directly tied together. Typically down here, during an expansion, we find output increases, unemployment tends to decrease, and you tend to get higher pressure on prices. And during a recession, we tend to get output going down, unemployment tends to increase and prices tend to decrease. Chapter 7, we have a whole chapter devoted toward unemployment and inflation. I'll just introduce the concepts briefly here. Unemployment represents those people who are 16 and older who are looking for work but cannot find work. So to be counted as unemployed, you have to be first without a job, but also be looking for work, which creates a problem, a discrepancy, a argument in terms of how we collect our data, which we'll talk about in Chapter 7. Because a lot of people who are not looking for work don't get counted in the figures, and a lot of people would say distorts things. Unemployment is a measurement of, unemployment rate is a measurement of unemployment that is defined as the percentage of the labor force that is officially classified as unemployed. And so when we say the unemployment rate, say, was 11.5%, which was recently, that means that 11.5% of the labor force is counted as unemployed. And the labor force are people who are currently employed, as well as those who are not employed but who are looking for work. So to be in the labor force, you have to be either employed or not employed but looking for work. And if you're not looking for work, then you are not counted as a labor force. Inflation rate looks at the increase in prices, and so when prices overall are increasing, we call that inflation. And if you have very high inflation, which we have not experienced in this country, but other countries have, it's been experienced in, say, a lot of South American economies, in Russia after the breakup of the Soviet Union. They also experienced very high inflation. That's known as hyperinflation. And then we have deflation. That's when prices are decreasing. You may think that would be a good thing to happen, but deflation is not something that we really want to desire. We'll find out in Chapter 7 what makes prices come down. And the main reason prices come down is a lack of sales, a lack of demand. And that means you're in a very serious recession normally. So typically you like to have a little bit of inflation in the system. It seems like prices rising about 1% to 2% a year tends to work very well. Anything higher than that can be more damaging to the value of your dollar. And anything lower than that, we tend to have an increase in unemployment more than we would like. And I showed you the graph above, what I drew by hand, and this gives you an actual graph of real GDP. And this goes back to 1980, 90, 2000, 2010, 2020. And this looks at the real increase in real GDP, and you can see the shaded areas are recession still. And you can see long-term trend is upward, except that little blip right there and that one there. This is the Great Recession. You can see the recessions prior to that, early 2000, early 1990s, early 1980s. The recessions were bad, but not as bad as the one right there. That is the one for 2008. And this is the coronavirus one right there. A huge decrease in real GDP, and in fact that right there is a decrease of 9.5%, which is the largest decrease in history, recorded history that we have for economic data. Our data really has only been collected in terms of pretty accurate data since the Second World War, and so I definitely say since the Second World War that is by far the largest decrease in our GDP, and that is for 1 quarter, 3 months. What we have here now is a definition of a recession, and what I'll do is I'll stop here and I'll do this the first part of going over the next lecture on Chapter 5.